have a seat. We're going to get started. I know we still have some people who haven't been here, so I will give my comments first. Just a few observations about what the public thinks about global climate change. You see the sources. I want to set the context because for the last 3 weeks, we've been talking about weather-related events and the extent to which they are or may be related to climate change, longer-term trends, and the difference between mitigation and adaptation. And tonight is our final class in this course, and we have two very distinguished people with us. We have Dr. Susanne Moser and Dr. Alan Lowenthal. Both of them are social scientists, and they've taken quite different career trajectories. One has chosen to go into public service after several decades of working in academia as a professor, and he was first on the city council and then in the legislature and representative in California. He's now state senator and is running for the U.S. Congress, and I will give them both a more complete introductions before they speak. And the other, Dr. Moser, though, has her own consulting company, and she works with the state of California and the federal government, and she has worked with a number of other states on all of the issues that we have been talking about over the last 3 weeks. So this is your chance to talk to people who use science to influence policy. And I want to make a few comments about some data, fairly quite recent, about what the public thinks about global climate change. You can see the sources. Americans who said that they were extremely sure that global warming was happening. November 2008, 45%. November 2011, 22%. Are we losing traction? American global warming skeptics who said they were extremely or very certain of their views. 35% in 2010, it went up by almost 20% in 2011. Are we losing traction with climate change as far as the public is concerned? 65% of Americans say they have never heard of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is surprising, I think, although I think if we probably surveyed the people who come into our aquarium, I doubt if 10% of them have ever heard of the IPCC. 41% of Americans believe most scientists think global warming is happening. 39% of Americans believe there's a lot of disagreement among scientists about global warming. 97% of working climate scientists see global warming as a serious risk. And there have been others where the 97% was as high as 99%. 74% of Americans trust climate scientists as a source of global warming information. 3% of Americans strongly agree that most of their friends are trying to act in ways that reduce global warming. 3%, not a very high percentage. What?
Can you go back to the 2 slides back?
That one?
Now go back again. 97% of scientists take over. Now go to the next one. 74% trust climate change. If that's the case, that 74% trust, why don't more people know about it and believe it?
I don't know. You can. I think you should ask Dr. Moser that question. She's a social scientist. Nobody said that these surveys are either accurate or precise. I'm just giving you.
Not about the survey.
Pardon?
It's not about the survey.
It's not about the survey? Okay, Susan, you can tell them. So, so here we are at the end of our course, and tonight we want to focus really on policy questions at the state and national levels. And our first speaker is Dr. Susanne Moser. She's director and principal researcher of Susanne Moser Research and Consulting in Santa Cruz. She's also a social science research fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University and a research associate at the University of California, Santa Cruz Institute for Marine Sciences. She served as a research scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, as a staff scientist for climate change for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she was a research fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Her work focuses on adaptation to climate change, vulnerability, resilience, climate change communication, social change, decision support, and the interactions among scientists, policymakers, and the public. She's a geographer by training, got her bachelor's degree in Germany and a Ph.D. in geography at Clark University, with an interest in how social science can inform society's responses to this global challenge. And I think it's important to point out, social scientists have not had enough involvement in many of these issues, and yet I think a lot of these surveys demonstrate that we need more social science. I'm on the NOAA Science Advisory Board. We have 2 social scientists now on the Science Advisory Board, and it's always, some of us argue we need to have more social scientists. Many of people of my colleagues say 2's enough. But these are social problems. They're not the scientific ones that are the problem. Susie contributed to Working Group 2 of the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that panel that nobody's ever heard of, but got a Nobel Prize. I think I won a prize at a county fair once. She's advised the Obama administration on communication on climate change, and she evaluated former Vice President Al Gore's climate change project. And she's very, very involved in all of these issues, and it's a great treat to have Dr. Susanne Moser here with us.
Wonderful. I always hate when people introduce me with that little Obama administration gig that I had. If I had really been successful, they maybe would do something different. Okay, I'm going to have to stand here to actually see my own slides. Thank you so much, Jerry, for having me here. It's really a great pleasure. Let's see what long leash I have to be to make this happen. Hang on one second. Okay, that worked? Okay, good. So, you asked me basically to give you a perspective on what the federal government is doing to address climate change. Now, this is not something that I study on a daily basis. I tend to be the person who goes knocking on the door of federal agencies or the White House or things like that to basically say you're not doing enough, you're not, but I'm bringing basically the news from the local level, from the state level to them. So I'll bring that bias to it, and I just, we'll put that out right there. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to go through a long, big civic lesson here as to, who is the federal government anyway. But I think it's important to think about who are the players that are involved in this and who is doing what. And so I'm going to run you through that a little bit, give you a bit of a history on what's been happening so far in mitigation, trying to reduce the problem from the front end, if you will, the causes. And then, because there's a lot more to talk about, I will turn to adaptation. And that is relatively recent. So we'll spend more time there and a few issues that I'm involved in. So in terms of where we're going from here, maybe we can keep that for the discussion later after you've heard from Alan. It's not often I get to be the warm-up act for a state senator. So anyway, so let's move to this right away. Who are we talking about? And I just, again, I want to run through this relatively quickly, but to give you a sense of what could you expect from different players at the federal level. So of course, the president is sort of the top honcho on this in terms of giving us leadership on this, could set policy direction. Obviously he's responsible for executing the laws. He could veto things that come down from Congress. commander-in-chief, and then of course his main task is to preserve the Constitution. The vice president could be active in these arenas as well. Sort of as you go down, it's like the longer hands of the president, right? Through his cabinet, through the commissions, federal commissions, and federal agencies that carry out whatever policy direction he sets. Now, Joe Biden is no Al Gore, you all know this, but basically that could be a place from which you could see leadership as well. The legislative branch, of course, is the one that could write laws, and very importantly, pass budgets, raise taxes that are relevant to climate change, approve international law, we'll come back to that in a minute, and then, of course, provide oversight as to whether everybody else is doing what the policies are. And then there's the judicial branch, not just with the Supreme Court, but all the federal court system components that basically deal with anything that concerns disputes between the states or federal government operations, and of course the interpretation of the Constitution, all of which could be highly relevant to mitigation and adaptation. I'll bring up some examples later where that plays a role, but this is basically who could do what, okay? Now the question is, what could they do? What are they? What is the nature of what they could do? And I put it sort of in, did I point this way? Yeah, okay. I put it in a couple of categories. One of them is through laws, regulation, or requirements associated with funding, the feds could basically make us, the rest of us, do something, right? Or, sort of in the carrot and stick kind of approach, it could encourage us to do something through funding, pricing, right? If energy is more expensive, then maybe we want to use a different kind of energy, that sort of thing. Preferred treatment. If you do this, you'll get the permit faster. Things like that. Release from other obligations, tit for tat kind of things. Then there's sort of the category of you could help people do something at other levels of government. Through joint planning, implementation, technical assistance, research, you provide the information that other people need, or information services, and we'll come back to that throughout. And then of course there's the whole bit of cleaning up your own act. I mean, the federal government is the biggest employer, the biggest energy user. There is a lot of things that the federal government itself could do that would have a tremendous impact on emissions and on dealing and preparing for the impact of climate change that you've discussed so far. So, I want to give you a couple of reasons why I think it's not enough to just think sort of as the federal response. I want you to think more of the federal players as being one in a set of actors that have to work together to get to a national response. And I'm sure you will hear more about this. Here's example one. This might be a scene you have come across somewhere in Southern California. In fact, it is from Southern California. Bad case of erosion with the house almost falling in the ocean at this point. You might think, well, bad luck for those folks, right? It's just a personal issue. They've chosen to live there, whatever. Well, who gave them the permit to do that? That's local government. Their permits are given in the context of what the local community has agreed to, namely a local coastal plan, which is something that they have to basically prepare in order to be in compliance with the California Coastal Act and through approval from the State Coastal Commission in compliance with the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act. If you want to do something about this particular situation as a way of adapting to rising sea level, you would have a lot of players involved. Okay, it's just one example. This one here, a fire in Southern California a few years back. Who was all involved in that? Well, at the first base of the level of land management, it is often public land managers and private landowners who have to do something with their land, right? How you manage a forest makes every bit of difference, how prone it is to begin to catch fire or something when the conditions are right climatically. And then when you get a case like this, the actual catastrophic fire, well then you have your local fire departments involved, the state emergency management services, you have federal management, emergency management involved, so that's FEMA or Department of Homeland Security, and on and on it goes. So again, a whole range of players involved both in preparing for those kinds of events and then when it happens, responding. If this were on public land, it might be the Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Forest service that might get involved in rebuilding the place after it burns down. So lots of different actors involved. And one last example, wind power. I put two examples here, one marine wind power offshore or on land. In both instances, you have, again, a whole different set of actors on the shore. If it goes out all the way to basically state land, federal or ocean water, federal waters or state waters, you have those involved. You need the federal government to give you permits, and so on and so forth. And on land, it's a similar issue, and there's some incredible complexities where basically the laws we currently have in place might prevent you from doing the right thing in terms of putting up wind power, because it might threaten some species, except that if you let wind power not happen, or if you don't reduce emissions, then that species will be wiped out by climate change. So there is like very bizarre and conflicting ways in which all levels, again, are involved, from the private property owner all the way to the federal government. And of course, to the extent that any of this relates to international agreements we might make with the rest of the world, this might even go all the way international. So lots to clear. Now, what are the three choices we have? I'm sure you have talked about those many times. I'm quoting here the current science advisor to the president, John Holdren, a mentor of mine from Harvard way back when. He said we basically have three choices to deal with climate change: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And we're going to do some mix of all three of those. Depends just on how much we do of one as to how much we have to do of the other. So I'm not going to talk about the policies or politics involved in suffering. I'll just focus on adaptation mitigation, although there's quite a bit about that could be said too. So we can come back to that. Mitigation. All these choices that reduce emissions. Let's see what we can do. And I want to run you through a little bit of a history here. And just to be not looking too biased, I have 3 Democratic presidents and 3 Republican, although I will declare my bias. None of them have done enough, and it gets less and less excusable. So that's my bias that I bring to this, and if you have a different opinion about it, I'd be happy to explore that with you. So let's start with Carter. What was going on back then? Well, you might remember that the year that he became president, we had an energy crisis. So that raised the attention on issues related to energy and climate, actually, quite a bit already. But essentially what he could manage to do was to throw some money at the research side. There was not really a big effort in really doing something about the climate at that time. If anything, it had to do something with efficiency standards and things like that. I don't know if Alan will talk about that, and the history in California going back to those days in terms of setting some of the strongest standards in that department. Then under Reagan, he didn't believe really in federal government doing much of anything regarding R&D or energy or climate, so he very much curtailed that. And yet, during his tenure, something got passed called the Global Climate Protection Act, which essentially just asked that the federal government come up with a coordinated policy. I don't know if that ever saw the day. I do not know of a document that says, and here's what we came up with. So maybe someone has that historical knowledge. I'm not familiar. Yes?
Was that in response to the Montreal Protocol?
No, something called the Toronto Conference at the time. There was a VLAC conference and then the Toronto meeting that basically got going on that aspect of climate change. So basically, the Congress felt like, we do something, but, again, whether or not anything really, that you could look up and find that, I'm not familiar with that, if that occurred. But then it happened just that summer of the last year of his presidency was a particularly hot summer, which raised public concerns. There was already in the scientific community quite a bit of concern with it, and so one of the great spokespeople from the scientific community gave a testimony in Congress. I don't know if you've heard the name Jim Hansen. He's been out in the news quite a bit. He is one of the more alarmed speakers about this. Some people call him alarmist. I don't think so, but that's, again, a matter of interpretation. Also, just sort of a few things that I want to note. In '85, we discovered the ozone hole, which is a very interesting thing for getting to the public opinion issues. if you ask people today, how does climate change work? Like, not folks like you who have just now had a nice course on this, but just regular folks out in the street. First thing they will say is, well, doesn't that have something to do with the ozone hole? And typically why that is because the first time people got an awareness of a global atmospheric problem was with the ozone hole. And so now everything through that mental model they now have in their head, they're trying to explain global warming through that idea in their head. And while it has to do with a hole in the atmosphere and there's more sun coming in and that's why it's warming up. I mean, really crazy ideas, but that's basically what people do. So I just mentioned it here. Also the year 88 when the IPCC was founded. So then we had Bush Sr., who actually during his tenure passed something called the U.S. Global Change Research Act, which is a really interesting law, still on the books, and you will hear more about that later, but it created an interagency climate change research program, Global Change Climate Change Research Program, and asked, basically, Congress asked the scientists to develop every 4 years a national assessment of what is happening with climate change, where are we, what does the science say, how serious is it, and how well are we prepared to deal with it. We'll come back to that. 92, we had the Rio conference, and the reason I mention it is because Senior Bush signed that, that international law, and it actually was ratified by the U.S. Congress, by the Senate. So the point here that I'm trying to make is we are actually bound already by an international law to reduce our emissions. You don't hear that often, and it's a problem. We're not following through on our international obligations. But we have ratified that, that convention. Then during the Clinton years, well, this gets probably, you probably have good memories of this by now. Anti-regulatory, anti-tax atmosphere, nothing basically that he wanted to do. And Al Gore, mind you, was at that point already very active on climate change. Nothing he proposed would pass through the Congress. And so anything that you see at that point is voluntary action. Why don't you guys do that? It would be a good idea, but nothing binding, okay? Quite a bit of research, even though, in that particular period, he inherited a lot of debt. So at the beginning of that period, there was a pretty small research budget, which eventually got bigger. And during those years, the first national assessment was produced. Now, from in 2000, that came out. So in 1990, the U.S. Global Change Research Act was passed that asked for these every 4 years. And the first one was produced in 2000. That's not every 4 years. Well, it took them a long time to basically get that machinery going. And it was incredibly engaging of people on the ground, not just the scientists, not just the agencies doing it, but it got in the re-election bid around 2000, it got very, very hot, it got very contested. The skeptics for climate change were at their utmost, and so it was a highly contested thing and disappeared the minute that George Bush came into office. Now, I want to also say during those years, the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of the ways in which the UN Climate Convention is basically made more concrete, okay? It basically specifies some things we can do to meet the obligations and the principles we set out in that first law. That was passed in '97 under Clinton, but it was never submitted to the Senate, and it was never ratified, and therefore we are not signers to the Kyoto Protocol, okay? Under Bush, during that tenure, basically we saw very interesting energy policies that essentially promoted more fossil fuels and nuclear, very hot and cold on renewables, because the Bush administration did not believe in international negotiations and multilateral agreement. Bush basically engaged in bilateral agreements with a whole bunch of countries. Nothing ever, committed anyone to do anything serious. What he did say under grand fanfare is that he would reduce greenhouse gas intensity by 18%. What that means is basically the amount of CO2 emitted per unit of GDP. And what he basically proposed is don't do anything. I mean, this is what happens anyway. You know, energy is too expensive. People produce things with less material, you know, make them more efficient. Happens anyway. So his grand fanfare proposal was a big zero in terms of really making a dent. Okay. And then under his tenure, a second national assessment was produced, and only because of basically the various people bringing a lawsuit to him that he's not obeying the U.S. Global Change Research Act, okay? Because he didn't do anything, you know, from that first one, 2004 would have been the second one, but he didn't do that. So then eventually there was a lawsuit that said you have to. And so that one was slapped together essentially overnight in a very short period of time. Didn't involve anyone except for a bunch of scientists and agency people. And that got published the minute Obama came into office. So since then, what we've seen is a president who ran on a pro-climate action campaign sort of platform, but pretty much a very low priority, since I say that, you know, someone in the administration would not say that, but if you compare it to everything else going on, it is pretty low. I mean, have you ever heard him talk about it publicly? Not often. Multiple climate bills in Congress, so there's a lot of, you know, now momentum building in those years for passing something. And even in Congress, there's sort of momentum. There were something like 25 different legislations proposed in Congress, both in the Senate and in complementary pieces in the House of Representatives. None of them passed. And then R&D funding increases that he proposed. He has a commitment to doing things that are innovative for both energy and for jobs, but basically every time he proposes an increase, the current Congress is such that, you know, they slash it wherever they can. So he's making some progress, but it's not getting as much traction as he would like. The most important thing probably that has happened is in 2009, and you notice that over this entire period, I've said nothing about adaptation, because nothing was done. For the first time in 2009, an administration made a public statement and a pretty strong one through an executive order to say, and the federal government shall figure out how to adapt to climate change. And we'll come back to that in a minute. CO2 regulation from power plants is another big deal in this administration. Through court cases that have finally declared CO2 a pollutant that fall under the Clean Air Act that EPA can regulate, there is now basically the possibility for future power plants that will be built to have to be more efficient and reduce their emissions. It's very difficult to see any quick changes that will have, because, you know, you first have to agree to build some. Yes?
Isn't that a link for new coal-fired plants?
Yes. Yeah.
Which are unlikely to be built?
That's why a lot of people are saying. But, you know, even if you need a retrofit permit, there's some, and I don't know all the like different provisions to it, but basically, you know, it's a big deal on some grounds, you know, in just getting something on the table basically, and having that written into law. But the likelihood of more coal plants to be built is, at the moment anyway, with the natural gas prices where they are, very unlikely. So, you know, it's a start. Like everything in this department, it's a start. So, the upshot in terms of emissions, this is the emissions curve for the United States. And what you see here, again, I put just sort of, you know, to put this in the frame of administrations, what you basically see here is the great emissions slasher is the economy, the crash that we had. That made more difference. I mean, if you think about it, that's, you know, the increase that you've seen roughly over this time frame, maybe 6 or something years, came down crashing when the economy crashed. Now that's not exactly a long-term program, and as you can see, the emissions are already going back up at this time with us coming out of recession, but that's basically what progress we're making. None. As with everything that's been done so far, it's not doing anything really. The recession did that. Now, if you want to know more about what Obama thinks he is doing, then I would recommend you go on this website on the the White House website, whitehouse.gov, and then /energy, where he details all of that and says what wonderful things he's doing in Durban and all these other follow-up conferences to the international negotiations. I find that so depressing I can't even go there. So I'll move on to adaptation, okay? Because that is more interesting in some ways. So here are just a few examples of things that one might consider in the future. So let's look at what they have done. Oops. And let's put this in context. So what you see here is from 1980 to about 2008, and the graph would continue in its upward trend if we continue that. The number of publications worldwide that looked at adaptation to climate change, okay? So what you can see is that there has been an exponential curve, if you will, in that field. Part of that has to do with the fact that the federal government in our country, and we could do something like this for just the US, until about 2008 or 9, has funded adaptation research at the tune of less than 1% of its entire global change research budget. So what happened in 2007 here, when this huge spike happened? Anybody want to guess what happened here? IPCC fourth assessment. Basically, it laid to bed the fact it's happening and it's human caused and we're in for trouble, okay? And at that point, with what's going on in Congress on mitigation, people all of a sudden thought, uh-oh, this is the uh-oh moment of policy shift toward adaptation, okay? This is when people realize we have to do something about this issue. Now, what you see here is basically that we're moving into that arena with having almost no understanding of it, right? We have hardly any science that tells us what's going to happen here, what are our vulnerabilities, and what is going to work to deal with that in the face of uncertainty. This is another graphic from a study that I did, which just looked about how adaptation is discussed in the news. Well, what you see here, similarly, the spike with the IPCC fourth assessment. And until then, I mean, these are real numbers, 40 for the entire United States. Articles on adaptation per year, okay? In 2006, it was 40. That was a good year. I mean, give me a break. This is how aware the public, policymakers, decision makers, planners are at that point. Not very, is the bottom line, okay? So there's this incredible rush that's happening right now in the United States where people are struggling to get a hold of what is this thing that we have to deal with? Where is the science that tells us what we can do? And it's not there yet, okay? But at this point comes Executive Order 13514 in 2009, where basically Obama said, but what it does, this executive order, is set some sustainability goals for federal agencies, not for the nation, calls for federal agencies to develop adaptation plans, and basically call together an interagency task force focused on adaptation that says, come back to me in a year and say what we ought to do, okay? That's the big moment. You can read it on the CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality, which is the research arm, if you will, of the White House. You can read it there. There you go. So then what did this interagency task force do? Well, basically it brought together over 20 federal entities, commissions or agencies, and its goal was to basically implement recommendations to minimize climate risk, to coordinate better among federal agencies, which would be phenomenal, and then to come back to the president and say, here's how we're doing. Here's how they define their role. This is what the federal actors at this level think they should do. Provide climate science and services to help communities make better decisions, and to manage basically climate risk on their own lands and operations and whatnot, right? That's national parks, that is naval facilities, I mean, the whole gamut, right? So, do you see anything missing? Anything that you think you would love to see from the federal agencies? Yes? What does that? Speak up about it? Say something? Yeah, that could be one thing. Communicate about it. What else? What else would you love to see from federal agencies to come?
Educating people.
Educating people, okay, a plan,
Timeline. Timeline.
a timeline, what else?
Market mechanisms such as cap and trade or carbon.
So you're getting at the incentives basically, or figuring out ways to pay for it, making it happen. What else, what you were gonna say?
Well, just the funding for it.
Funding, that would be a really big thing, right? If you want somebody else to do something, but they're already strapped, they're going through the same economic crisis everybody else is going on, how do you expect them to do anything? Well, that would help. I mean, you know, one of the other things that, if you remember the 4 categories that I put out there, what's here basically is help them and do your own business, basically lead by example. None of that induce them or encourage them, and certainly no making them. There's no laws right now that, you know, do anything to make anyone do anything. Okay, so this is what they came back with a year later, saying you got to build resilience in communities, you got to make the science more accessible, integrate climate risk management into everything we do, develop strategies to safeguard, in particular, our natural resources, and help with adaptation in the international context. And they're actually doing that. And let me show you how that looks. So this basically, the first progress report, you know, you got to think of it. The federal government is in the same boat as everybody else. They're just sort of coming to the realization, we have to adapt. So the first step that they took, which is, you know, seems not like a heck of a lot, but it's important. Basically, they laid down some principles. What should guide our thinking? If everybody goes off in their own direction and they're not guided by the same principles, it's going to be a big mess. So to come up with something that then applies to everyone seems like a decent first step. And then basically they just came out with a second progress report, but this was an important one in terms of setting out sort of policy goals and principles. Now, since then, they have come out with an action plan for freshwater resources and how to make sure that we have enough. They have come out with a guidance document, basically that gives other agencies sort of a common set of assumptions and ways to do it. You know, all of these people haven't done it before, so just so we have a common standard, they basically provide a guidance. They're currently waiting for those adaptation plans to come through. Between February and June is not a long time. Do not expect those to be dramatic documents, but they're the first step for them to even get on the page, okay? Yes,
So would that be planning assumptions to feed into EISs, for example?
For example, I mean, I don't know if it's already at that level. That's regulatory. So, you know, agencies basically carry out the laws that Congress passes, and Congress has not put anything forward that says, and thou shalt do adaptation and, you know, revise your ESA, whatever, to EIS to basically bring adaptation and climate assumptions into it. They have not done that. And then there's a whole bunch of other documents. One that just came out, National Fish, Wildlife, and Plant Adaptation Strategy, and then an implementation plan for the National Ocean Policy is expected very soon. So those are all efforts that have happened since that first one. What are they doing in terms of supporting for the communities and businesses? Well, it basically comes down to guides and information. You see here just a bunch of them. This is, you know, rolling easements. What is that? How do we use that in land management, in coastal management? Here's an adaptation toolkit from the Center, Coastal Services Center, NOAA, for coastal planners. So, you know, it's things like that, just to help people get on the page and start doing these sorts of things. Recognizing full well that they have limited resources, and that would be a place to start. They've heard that plenty of times that those guides would be needed. You know, we can talk more about how they translate to the ground and whether people know about them and whether that's communicated and everybody's on board. But anyway, so then the information bit. This is a bit of a funny story, and I'm sure Jerry could tell the inside story on this. NOAA had the idea of to develop something called climate services, something that is sort of a parallel thing to the National Weather Service, but for climate, for these longer term projections and predictions, right? Well, basically, they were saying that, we're already doing some of that work, but it's in this part of the agency, that part of the agency, this, whatever. It's not coordinated, it's not as efficient as it could be, so they came up with a proposal, and with the encouragement of the Obama administration, to consolidate that through an internal reorganization, okay? Now, you notice here this little word, prototype. That's the story. It is only a prototype. Right now it exists only in this form of a web page. I'll come back to that. So, but here's the challenge with developing climate services. You have people in business along the coast, recreation, ecosystem managers in the private sector, people who want to do wind energy, farmers on the coast, people who have, for all of those folks want climate information, very different kinds. Everyone needs something different for different time frames, for a different location. So how do you do that, right? This is why they basically thought it would be more efficient if we consolidated operations. And then you have the issue that some people needed for annual decisions, like what should I plant this year? While other people want to know, should I put in a new irrigation project? That will be with me for a long time. So I need to know, if I put something in now, is it still going to work or necessary or whatever in 30 years? It would be a big investment if you did it for not, right? Then think more about building a large dam. Well, not only to build it takes a long time, but it's going to be up there for a very long time. So now you get out into those projections where, it makes a big difference. Is it going to be 4 degrees or is it going to be 2 degrees? So planning under uncertainty with very different needs. How do you do that? There you go. So this was the idea, the vision, that NOAA will provide science and services to basically produce or help an informed society that is capable of anticipating and responding to climate and its impacts. And it had a very clear mission to do that basically through strengthening of the knowledge, providing authoritative and timely information. Timely is important. If you send a forecast 2 weeks after the decision is made, not helpful. Informing decision-making and management, in other words, you actually got to be relevant to stuff people do. And that's very local. So that was what they had in mind. And then Congress nixed it. In November 2009, House Republicans, led by a Texas Republican, Ralph Hall, basically killed this provision that was attached to, I guess it was an appropriation bill, to create this climate service within NOAA. And basically, if you look at the arguments that they brought forth, they said it would cost money. They showed it wouldn't cost money because it would actually make things more efficient. It shows that they basically, were denying the problem to begin with. It's leaving a lot of people who are dependent on this kind of information without it, delaying it. So now what NOAA does is basically have this website up called climate.gov. You can look it up. And it's a newsy type thing. There is some educational background about climate change, but it is just the website where they pulled some things together. It is not the underlying operation that would make it efficient to produce the stuff that decision makers need. So that's what's there. I guess I want to highlight a couple of things that the federal government does that link science to decision makers in an effective way. And this is my favorite program. It's probably doing it the best of all of them that are currently in existence, called the RISA program under NOAA, Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Centers. They're basically university-based research centers where people engage on a constant basis with farmers, ranchers, water managers, you name it, coastal managers, wherever they are. They actually listen to them, they go to them, they say, what do you guys need? Then that inspires some kind of, oh my God, we can't answer your question. But that really stimulates new research. So they go and do the research, they bring it back to the people. So there's this constant, going back and forth. And I think this is probably the model that it should be, because who in Washington could figure out everyone's need everywhere else in the country for every sector and every level of decision making? Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to be part of the game too. They came up with something called Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. You see, they have that covered, but only as a map. And there's a center in each one of these. And they're trying to build something like that, but it's only going to be about fish and wildlife. I mean, basically about ecosystems. It's not necessarily integrated across issues, cross-sectoral interactions. So it's not making up for it. This is not basically the replacement. And then USDA has some, the green spots here, has its own places where they work with farmers. Again, it's just farmers. So there's something there. There's not nothing. But we're not internally or at the federal level coordinated to provide what the nation needs. Now let me turn for a short while to the research side of it, because I think that's interesting too. So I told you in 1990 the U.S. Global Change Research Act was passed, which established the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is basically, if you take CEQ away, a conglomerate of 13 agencies that have some climate sensitivity. I mean, be it NASA with their satellites, or NSF, the National Science Foundation, doing a lot of research, or EPA or whatever. NOAA is there. So basically all of these different agencies that have something to do with climate change research, global change research, and the point of this program is to coordinate this. It's been hampered by lots of problems over time, but basically this is what we have to lead it. What I plotted here briefly, just whatever data I could find, is the research funding for the entire program. And as you can see over time, it goes up in actual dollars spent. If you make it constant dollars, you see that the purchasing power is going back. I couldn't figure out, I only found constant to 2007, so that's why that curve ends. But basically, there's a small increase, but the purchasing power probably was highest in the mid-90s and is declining since. As the problem gets worse, you wonder whether we have our priorities straight. If I did this as a proportion of GDP or whatever, it would be a downward slope, even though the actual dollars go up. But that's what we're doing, and what you see here, this little spike, that's the American Recovery Act additional funding. So, but you do see that the Obama administration would like to spend more money in this arena. So they have John Holdren, they have Stephen Chu in the Energy Department. They have some really high, big hitters. Jane Luchenko at NOAA, some big hitters in the scientific community in the administration at highest levels. So there is some evidence there for scientific influence on policy, if you will. Yes, you had a question.
I think it was a statement, actually, sorry. That was 3 months after Obama was elected. The U.S. EPA and Air Waste Management Association Smellers had a greenhouse gas measurement symposium in South San Francisco that they pulled together very, very quickly once they could.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, people here, during the Bush years were just waiting in the wings basically until they could talk climate change again. And then once they did, a lot of things that were basically ready to go, then were able to be funded. So a nation globally engaged. Now, stop right there and have a good laugh. Nation globally engaged and guided by science, meeting the challenge of climate change. That's the vision of the program, to build the knowledge, inform human response, and coordinate all these efforts at the federal level. That's what they want to do. And they just came out with a new strategic plan. This is the at least third. There was temporarily sort of a fourth one in the making, but that got killed in the Bush administration. But this is the third one for 10 years. And these words here are rather remarkable. If you have followed this at all, basically, before it was advance the physical science, advance the physical science, advance the physical science, maybe the ecological science, stop. And nothing else. Now it sounds like, okay, advance the science, which is a really broad portfolio. They have now a person singularly focused on adaptation in that program, okay? Informed decisions, a whole different orientation than basic research in the lab or whatever. Sustained assessment, I'll come back to that in a minute, and then this whole issue that people brought up earlier, communicate and educate the public about it. I want to come back to this assessment business a little bit. So Section 106 of the Research Act basically said, thou shalt do these assessments every 4 years, integrate what is known through programmatic research that was done, analyze the effects of global change. They gave like a whole list of sectors, very specific ones that are named, including human health, welfare, social systems, natural environment, and a whole bunch of sectors. And then analyze what what the trends are right now, whether they're human or natural, doesn't matter, and say what might happen to us 25 years or 100 years out, okay? So we did the first one that had a lot of engagement of people on the ground, and then that was a very big effort to make that happen. There was no funding to basically bring people together. People just, gave of their blood and bones to make that happen. That report actually came out, as I said before, in the interim between the Clinton administration and Bush, but was released under Bush, and he couldn't help himself. Basically, he needed to do it because the law demanded that he deliver it. And then he kind of said, okay, we're doing something different. We're not doing these assessments. He came out with 21 different reports that were only known to the federal government. The rest of you probably have never heard of them. And then they were forced by lawsuit to produce an assessment to Congress, a synthesis, not just all these, some of them were this fat. Who in Congress is ever going to read that? So basically he produced, in a very short amount of time, this synthesis report that you all probably have never heard of, right? Anyone ever seen this thing? It's a really frightening document when you actually read the fine print. It is now available on the web. We're trying to make it more, give it more publicity. And we're now in the process, and I'm deeply involved in that, in the third National Climate Assessment, which is supposed to be out in 2013 because our dear leader, Kathy Jacobs, a water manager from Arizona originally, she said, and I will get this thing out as the law says in 4 years. So we're all dying trying to make that happen. It is an enormous endeavor. But one thing we have learned over all these assessments, both the national ones and international ones, is that you can't do this. Start up a whole operation, break it down, tell everyone to go home, then when you feel like you need to do it again, bring everybody back, and do it again. It doesn't make sense. What we need to establish is something that is far more sustained over time, with building capacity, not just in the agencies, but you want to make sure anyone in the hinterlands knows about it. So we're doing the sustainable process, trying to build that with not just one product every 4 years, but multiple ones for different users. We have a whole bunch of new topics. Coastal and ocean is going to be a major one. We're going to develop a set of indicators that will be updated every 4 years. So it's like the GDP of the environment, how are we doing? Building networks. We're going to bring in the international context. Now there's a revolutionary idea. We're not existing in isolation. Through trade, through business, through stuff, disease vectors, we're connected with everyone, right? So we're going to bring that in. We're going to say if something happens outside our borders, it makes a difference here. Sometimes bigger. There's a huge effort on the engagement and communication. Again, without funding. It's really fabulous to do that without. And so on and so forth. And one of the things that we will do is, that the government is in the process of doing, is to build a one-stop location for all things related to global change for the federal government. It's going to be a huge thing. Development of this global change information system so that anyone can go there. It's basically doing what NOAA suggested, just under a different name. We just call it now an information system. So where next? I'm going to stop. Well, I guess that's your choice in part as to where we go. And I'm going to show you in a minute one thing that he said. So I think, he has a choice maybe in the second term, if he gets one, to finish some unfinished business. Or, I call it the reviving the governor within. When Mitt Romney was governor of Massachusetts, he did some really good things in Massachusetts on climate change. But you wouldn't know it if you listened to him now talk about climate change, which doesn't exist as far as he's concerned. And I think the bigger choice probably is in who gets to go into Congress. Because pretty much any legislation, any attempt to provide leadership that is longer lasting than an executive order, which can end the minute the president goes out of office. I mean, all this adaptation work will go away if Romney comes in and says, we're not doing that anymore. So, we need something more permanent, i.e. Political representatives that basically suggest that we put laws into place that will help us do this on a long-term basis. So here's a quote from Barack Obama. We have a choice. We can either shape our future, we can let events shape it for us, we can fall back on the stale debates and old divisions, or we can decide to move forward and meet this challenge together. We know that the problems we face are made by human beings. That means it's within our capacity to solve them. The question is whether we will have that will to do so, whether we'll summon the courage and exercise the leadership to chart a new course. That's the responsibility of our generation. That must be our legacy for generations to come. And I am looking forward to being a strong partner in this effort. You probably never heard that quote, but he said it. It's available on the web. So I want to close with this here, which is FDR is said to have become president. A group of progressive activists asked him to push for something really big. And his response was, I agree with you. I want to do it. Now make me do it. So we got to make him do it. Thanks.
Before our next speaker, we do have time for a couple of questions. Anybody have a question? Yes, go ahead.
This morning, James Hansen came out with the New York Times op-ed, and he wrote that Canada, if Canada's allowed to develop their tar sands, then it's basically game over. And he was very pessimistic about his viewpoints. So we can develop all these treaties and all these regulations, but if you have other countries doing like what Canada will do,
Yeah, that's often been used as an argument, and you're right. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, the atmosphere doesn't care whether the CO2 comes from you or from Canada or from China or from India, right, or Brazil. It doesn't matter to the atmosphere whose name is on it. But the United States, as the biggest economy of the world, can have such an influence on what happens internationally. You know, I think that is where the leverage lies. If we ever moved, that would make a huge difference. I mean, you know, China right now does more on renewable energy. Germany does more on renewable energy. I mean, there is so much activity going on, mostly because people are beginning to see their self-interest being impacted. I mean, China is really worried about all those glaciers in the Himalaya melting down. Why? Because that's the water we need to feed 1.5 billion Chinese people. So they have a big interest in doing that. And eventually, you know, my opinion actually is if the United States keeps waiting, it's going to be overrun, I mean, by people doing stuff, and we will have missed all the opportunities economically.
Let me just say a word about the National Climate Service.
Oh, sure, please.
This
Now you get the
was
real
something the president urged the administrator of NOAA to stand up the National Climate Service. And as Susie observed, it was created by a process of aggregation of existing programs within NOAA, and it was to be kind of the twin of the National Weather Service. Weather, what's happening now in short range, climate over longer periods, and so it was revenue neutral. And when Congress took the NOAA budget, every place climate service appeared, they not only took it out, they took all the funding out. And so NOAA lost other functions related to climate that had been in place for a long time. It was really it was a punitive attack on the idea. NASA was cleverer in their budget because NASA does a lot of climate work, but they never used the word climate. So their budget went up relative to NOAA. NOAA's went down. NOAA's continues to go down, and it's really, I think, a very sad story. Yes.
Some of these initiatives are run federally, so that's where the budgets are being slashed, right? So
Yeah.
is there a way to fund them privately?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, you know, as you will hear in a minute, states and local communities and private businesses are not waiting for the federal government because they already see their shorelines, their water resources, their ecosystems being impacted. So, but it's very difficult to do some things without federal assistance or without sort of a way of bringing people together. You know, even regionally to address something. And so basically the foundation funding that's out there right now working on adaptation, what I would say it does, it is building capacity. Basically, you know, testing in pilot cases what could be done, trying to, get planners to have greater understanding of the issues and how to do these things, how to use the tools that are coming out. So a lot of it is at the stage of adaptive capacity building, if you will. And that's valuable, but the amount of stuff that needs to be done, I think, actually fall constitutionally under the responsibility of the federal government, and they're not doing it. I mean, I didn't put this up here, but almost every week I get updates, policy updates about what's happening in Congress, and especially around budget times. Basically there are these little riders that they slip into every appropriation bill that says, "And thou shalt be prohibited from doing any work on adaptation." So while the executive order tells them you have to produce these reports, the federal, the funding that basically supports the work of the agencies is being slashed, and they're explicitly told not to work on it. So they're between a rock and a hard place. It's very difficult to do work, when two people tell you very different things. So it's a really difficult thing. They're all hush hush. They're all renaming what they're doing. It's not called climate. Whether it's NOAA is one example. EPA is a big loser in this for years. They're totally being slashed. Army Corps, you name it. I mean, they're FEMA. They don't want to talk about it, even though all their folks, are saying, like, we've got to help these communities. I mean, I had this on here, one bullet that said, the demand for this type of information is already beyond the capacity of the government to do it, but their budgets are slashed to do it. So basically, what that amounts to is that the responsibility falls on the states, or they're on their own. And it's
The other part that I think is important is that we had a panel discussion earlier this week in Silver Spring, and Michael Jones from Google, who's one of the founders of Google and chief technology advocate, they call him, and somebody from NSF, and we have foundations there, and they said you can count on us, foundations, Google, to help start things, but we will never sustain anything. Mm-hmm. It's the federal government and the state government's role to sustain these long-term programs that need to be systemic.
And in a place or in a situation where the climate is continually changing, it's not like we're going to fix this once. It's like a one-time investment, and then all the roads will be fixed and we're fine. I mean, the climate is continually changing. So you can't just do it once and go home and say, that's it. You got to stay with it. So how do you build that kind of, the institutional framework for continual change? How do you, build a capacity in your country to do that? So those are the difficult things that are not being addressed. And I think what that basically means is we're going to be running crisis after crisis when things get even worse than they are now.
We're going to take one more. Go ahead.
I was just watching everything the past year. It's been very frustrating politics-wise.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any possibility that we could possibly bridge a gap between both sides and kind of come to the middle of the road again? I mean, I can remember in the past politics that you've never had way over here and way over here, and I feel like sometimes with every single issue, we always have to be on opposite sides. We never can kind of bridge that gap. Do you think on this or in the future that we could possibly bridge the gap, or will it be just we're never going to see that?
Well, that's wow. Do we have time for beer or something like that? It's a much longer conversation. What I would say is that I have a feeling that Americans are going to get really sick very quickly of the current polarization, because it's my conviction, based on sort of the kind of data that Jerry showed, is that the vast majority of Americans don't hold strong opinions. 75% are in the middle. And nobody talks about them. They don't get heard. They don't have a mirror. They don't have a microphone, right? It's those people on the edges that really constantly are in the news. And I think people will just see how devastating that kind of politics has been. So having said that, that will bring us to hopefully a different composition in Congress, and I think lots can be done. And there are some areas in which I think you can improve efficiency in government. You can certainly, avoid some of the crazy things that, levels of bureaucracy you need, whatever. I'm sure we need that if we want to be more flexible. The most challenging system is one that is this stiff in the face of change, right? So you have to make it more nimble, and that often means smaller, less bureaucratic, whatever. So I think we can actually come closer to some of their demands of less government. But I think the illusion of having no government and getting through this together is actually non-constitutional. That's good, you know, and I'll stop there.
Okay, well, while we get Alan wired up, I think I would just add to that, democracy was founded on compromise. And, but it's interesting that I think we don't have strong leadership on either side right now, or people who know how to make deals. Read one of the reviews of the latest books on Lyndon Johnson, The Master. And Bill Clinton's review of this volume said he was the most powerful, most effective leader of Congress we have ever had in the history of the nation. He knew how to make deals. Right now, seeing compromise is seen as being weak or ignoble, and you had a comment that we should be paying attention who we're going to send to Congress. Well, our next speaker is someone that many of us would like to send to Congress. Get him out of here. No.
Our next speaker is State Senator Alan Lowenthal, and a great friend of many of us in this room and of this aquarium. He's widely recognized as one of the most effective and highly respected legislators in Sacramento. He's a former educator, several decades as a professor at Cal State Long Beach, city council member, and a long-serving state representative. And all of this service, and now as a state senator, has provided him with really good insights about the challenges facing this state. He's a nationally recognized leader on issues related to goods movement. As the former chair of the State Senate Transportation Committee and the current chair of the Select Committee on Goods Movement, he played a leading role in developing innovative programs that both increased the efficiency of the movement of goods and it led to the protection of the environment. That took compromise, and we all benefited from it. And he is widely regarded as one of the strongest environmental advocates in this state and has received many awards from the California League of Conservation Voters, the Sierra Club, Planning and Conservation League, and the California Coastal Commission. He was one of the leaders in the redistricting, and as I say, he is now running for the U.S. Congress. He serves as the chair of the Senate Committee on Education, and having been an educator for all those years, he knows what it takes to have high-quality education. He lives here in Long Beach, and we're delighted to have his wife with us this evening also. I got a free medical advice. So thank you for that. He got his BA from Hobart College and a Ph.D. from the Ohio State University. I don't think he was on a football scholarship at Ohio State.
I was a lineman.
Please welcome Senator Alan Lowenthal.
Now, Alan doesn't have any slides.
I don't have any slides.
He said that's only for people like us. He doesn't need any of these credits. Do you want to use any of your slides? Keith, maybe you could turn that off, then we can get all done.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Alan Lowenthal. Jerry said I'm the state senator from here. I don't have all the statistics and all the data that we have. I'm just going to try to give you an update on where we are in California, a little bit of an update. And maybe give a little, I think the most interesting thing is a little commentary on the side, to tell you what's, from my perspective, what I see as kind of really going on, rather than necessarily saying that it's, I'm going to give you the truth of the whole, all the issues. Okay, right, I'll keep my notes, because I need my notes. I don't have the PowerPoint. We're now talking about the budget. Well, let me step back. First, it's great to be here. I was at one other class, I think, before I came also to an earlier class. I was a Cal State Long Beach professor of psychology. Worked on a lot of community projects, so talking about compromise, my whole career in academia was how do you build consensus? How do you bring people together, especially people who felt they weren't being listened to, and people who were in power, who were not doing, at least to the community, feeling that they weren't being listened to, and people in power feeling like they were listening. But like what we just heard, lots of times nothing was getting done. So that was my career, and after a big incident, I was not necessarily an environmental leader or any other leader. I was a community activist, a psychologist, interested in community psychology. And there had been an incident in Long Beach, and that incident really had to, let me shut this off. I gotta get rid of this. Okay, it's forward. And it led to kind of a social upheaval, and I kind of got a lot of people involved, and out of that, and that was in the early 1990s, I decided that because I thought government wasn't working, and a lot of this is how do you influence policymakers, I decided I'm going to run for city council. That was it. I didn't have any money or resources. I was a college professor. I had lots of friends in the community, and so I walked the district telling them why I was going to run, why I really wanted to run. And people would always say, well, that's really interesting, that's why you want to run, but Alan, what's this black soot in the window? And that was in 1992, and I said, I don't know what the black soot, and the district was basically from the Port of Long Beach out to Redondo Avenue and up to 10th Street. And so I'd be walking along Ocean Boulevard at 1st and 2nd and 3rd, and people kept telling me, as I'm getting closer and closer to the downtown, what is this black soot? Nobody ever, So I said, well, I don't really know. I got the same black soot. I thought it was because I was, not cleaning up my house, but I'm glad that everybody has the black soot. I said, let's get together. Let's all set up a task force. Let's do research. Let's find out what it is. And that led me to understanding that we live in a particular environment, and an environment that not necessarily at that time was I thinking about greenhouse gases and climate change, but it was one in which we were living under a cloud of diesel particulates, dirty diesel particulates in this region. And it was just accepted as part of doing business. That's what you had to do. We had the largest single concentration of diesel particulates almost in the nation, maybe in the nation. With both ports, with trains coming in, trucks coming in, ships coming in, and each one, as you remember in the early 1990s and in the 1980s when you drove along the 710 freeway, if any of you were here, you would just hope you wouldn't get behind one of these trucks that was belching this black smoke out, because black smoke was just coming out of the trucks. So it took me some time to understand that, and maybe this gets to the issue of compromise, that first you have to understand what the issue is and what the problem, and who's been studying it. And in this process, you are never, even though you may get credit or not credit, you are never the first person. Once you start to understand what's going on, you find that there were people out there researching this and doing this for many years, and that no one was listening to them. So first, you have to find out, and I found that there were some great heroes, and some of them really suffered public health and health effects from doing it, living down by the ports and doing this. But I just gathered and became part of the group, and that's one of the things. You're much more effective when there's more of you than less of you. It's always good to know that whatever you're doing, that no matter how good your ideas are, tell them to somebody else and get other people involved with you, or join groups. So I began and that was 1992. It's now 2012. I'm not doing quite as much at this time, but a 20-year adventure to reduce pollution, reduce particulates that are going into the air, and as Jerry said also, to understand that we live in, we enjoy the benefits of this society because we have economic opportunities to grow and prosper also. And so whatever we're doing, we have to make sure that you have a vision of where you're going, whether we're talking about greenhouse gas reduction or, and in part, I saw us going really early on to a world in which we would eliminate the pollution, we would grow the jobs here, we would become the distribution centers of the world, and we would set a goal and figure out how do we get towards zero emission systems. All we have to do is to reduce our systems to livable, sustainable systems. And along the way, when I first started, just to talk about compromise, they thought I was a communist. They literally did when I first ran for city council, and they said you can't have economic development and environmental protection. You just can't have the two together. You are either going to have one or the other. You're either going to be an environmentalist or you're going to stop and understand that this is the engine that's driving the economic engine. And I kept believing if it's good now, we can make it better, and if we can solve it here, we can sell it anywhere in the world. You know, if we can fix this in the community and clean up this basin and make jobs here also, and doing it, and invest in new clean technologies. So in doing, and I think one of the problems is that, and I think it could be and I can only talk about the state legislature now and talk about, is that you have to really be persistent on these things, and you have to hang in there and do them and not count successes, whatever we're talking, in weeks or months, but it's every single day as long as you are for years. And part of our system is that we don't reward that. We reward immediate kinds of things, and now in term limits, people don't really learn their trade, and we have that. And so I think there are some real structural problems that lead to some of the polarization that takes place in the state of California. That's one of them. When you have to break bread with somebody for a long time, you break down some of this stuff. When you build walls and you separate it, whether it's by ideology or by years of service, whatever, when you build walls, it gets in the way, because when you find out is at the end of the day, we're not all that different, even in our, no matter where we are. And so, but it takes a lot of work to get there. So that's the first thing. So that's where I come from. So I've been persistent in it, and I'll tell you a little bit about later on about some of the things that we've done towards reduction of greenhouse gases here in terms of adaptation. But I did it because I got real scared. I think maybe that's another one, and maybe we're not. I got real scared. We don't do that enough about greenhouse gas. I got real scared that kids were getting asthma, people were dying, and it was happening right now in this community, and somebody was going to say to me, my kids or my grandkids at some point, what did you do about it when you were there? So sometimes what we're talking about is very abstract now. We're talking through, that's why I think adaptation is very important, because we get down to dealing with the reality of what's going on right now and what you're going to fix, because people can't feel it. It's very hard to, to deal with things. And so that's one of the things that I learned, is that you've got to make it concrete and real and touch people's lives. And for me, that's why I come here. As far as where the state is, so then I went on and became elected to the State Assembly in 1998 after being on the City Council. And in the early 2000s, and that's really where my history about really what we're dealing with in terms of greenhouse, climate change, and my understanding of the role of greenhouse gases and CO2 was, in the early 2000s, I had the fortune of serving with Fran Pavley in the Assembly. And Fran was working on, which I think was a critical bill that was quite different than, and maybe it was because of the times. In the early 2000s, we still had this tremendously optimistic spirit about where we were going and where we were. And Fran's I think it was 14, was it 57? 1493, AB 1493. Anybody here know about AB 1493? Yes. Huh?
Is that the vehicle emission?
That's it, tailpipe emission. All of a sudden, we were talking in the state legislature and kind of really getting in. We could really impact and do a major impact in terms of reduction of carbon dioxide. We could push the rest of the nation and push and say, and even though the automobile industry kept saying you're not allowed to do it, you can't do it in California, it's a national issue, we're going to fight you. Hadley really fought hard, and we passed the first tailpipe emission, I think it was the first tailpipe emission bill in the nation. And that bill, because we're going to talk about AB 32, is the cornerstone in part of AB 32, because that bill is where we're going to realize the reductions in greenhouse gases. And that bill caught fire in the rest of the nation also, and other states developed it and picked it up, and it became a network of sin. I believe towards the end they were to push Washington, because this does not start at the top, it always comes from the bottom up. And that bill and 17 states joined together, and we were in litigation. We all joined together in a lawsuit, which we won, states won, and now the federal government has adopted that policy. So that, to me, was the first major change in California law, and that was in the early 2000s. Following that, 2 years later, I think it was, 2 or 3 years later, came AB 32. Most of you know about AB 32. AB 32 was a radical change. It said that California is going to implement different kinds of strategies, and we can talk about it under the Air Resources Board, but we are going to reduce greenhouse gases to by the year 2020. We are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions down to 1990 levels. That was from where we were at that time, about a 15-20% reduction, where if we had kept going the way we were producing greenhouse gases, and especially before Hadley, we would have had a 30% or 20 or 30% increase. That was the rate. Now we're talking about dropping it down to 1990 levels. And that was AB 32. I think that was the second and maybe the most critical bill. Politically, that was a very interesting bill also, I'll tell you why. At first, nobody wanted to help. Hadley was on her own doing it. After a while, because she introduced it, she worked on it. After a while, she lost control of her bill, because then the speaker wanted it to be his bill, and the governor wanted it to be his bill. And it became, all of a sudden, Hadley. You never hear the name Hadley on AB 32. It's either Nunez or Schwarzenegger, but it was really Hadley that did all the work. But sometimes things get co-opted. But if you really care about this business, you don't care if your stuff gets co-opted or not. It's not the name. It's that California did this. And what a nice time comparing to what we heard in the, and I'm not saying it was an easy bill or that we're going to be easy to implement it. And I'll talk to you about one of the strategies now that we're trying to deal with, how we implement it. But what a nice thing that people want to steal your bill, because they want to have their name on it, because it's such an important thing. In Washington, what we heard is everybody wants to run away from it all and not have anybody's name on it, and if they even see the terms on it. But that was only 5 or 6, 7, 2006. That was only really 6 years ago. So it was a different world 6 years ago, because you have to understand that 2008 was really a critical time. And I will say that in California also, and in the rest of the nation and the world. And once the financial markets began to collapse, and once the housing crisis became statewide, and once we became one of the 4 states that had the most extreme numbers of foreclosures, because there were 88% of the subprime mortgages were written in 4 states, the largest one being California. We just fell off a cliff. Our economy just went in. And so right now, since 2008 to today, literally, we spend a phenomenal amount of time talking about a budget, how you keep things going, what is being cut, what is not being cut. It's more of a survival mentality than it is a planning mentality and a well-being mentality and looking at the issues that we have to confront. And as you know in your own lives, when you're confronted with crises, sometimes you constrict kind of other kinds of input. It is not a healthy situation to be in for a long time. And we as a state and a nation have been in it now for 4 years. And so this is like the Great Depression. I don't care what anybody tells us. You know, this is very, very serious. At a time when we have lots and lots of issues that have to be dealt with in the long term. We have to have a well-educated workforce. We have to deal with climate change. These are issues that you don't have choices with, but we're forced to have to live within our means and to deal with budgets. So there are a number of I want to tell you, and maybe kind of bring it up to date a little bit, some of the things that are going on. How are we going to implement AB 32? You know, now we're talking about, first, how we're going to mitigate, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing or not doing in terms of adaptation. So if AB 32 really set the stage, and California now has said, hey, we're going to have these ambitious goals. ARB, we're going to do a scoping plan and a process, and you're going to set targets, and some of those targets will be reached by command and control. You know what I mean by command and control? Anybody have a guess what I mean by command and control? Go into that concrete factory and tell them they're cutting their emissions by 30%. You don't care how they do it, they're going to, whatever it is. That's one way. Another way is to provide a little bit more of a market-based set standards and allow us to auction credits off, and if you can meet those standards, you can sell some of those credits, so we'll still reach it down. And I think our AB 32 called for about 20% of the emissions could be dealt with in terms of some kind of credit system, a cap and trade credit system, and the others would be done through either things like tailpipe emissions and other kinds of regulations, changing business practices, changing water practices, conservation, energy efficiency, alternative energy, all would be dealt with in that way. So the big one now facing us is, okay, that 20%, that part that we're now into the implementation in terms of cap and trade, how are we going to do it? How are we going to deal with this? Now, I'm not an expert on cap and trade, right? So I'm not here to tell you I'm an expert. I am interested on the budget subcommittee in the state senate. And what we do on the budget subcommittee is, governor gives us a budget in January. We kind of go through the budget. And there are 5 different budget subcommittees. There's one on education, and there's one on health and human services, and there's one on corrections. I sit on the one on resources, environment, transportation. That's the one. It's a 3-person subcommittee. So we get the governor's budget. We kind of make recommendations, change it around to the full budget committee. Then the governor comes out on Monday, this coming Monday, May 15th, with a May revise based upon the April taxes, and then we have to get a budget done by the beginning of June. So cap and trade came before our committee. Now, as a legislator, I will tell you, it is, I have all these different opinions, and more, maybe this is more as a psychologist and not as an ideologue in any political party, but you know, you form opinions of people based, you know, we all do in terms of our relationships. So my opinion frequently of the governor is that on a budget committee is that he comes out with sometimes these great ideas, but I don't know how you fill in the blanks. I mean, there are just huge holes between them. He's a Jesuit priest, big thinker, doesn't go through the specifics. So it's just his style. It's wonderful, but it's just his style. Sometimes you can drive me crazy when you're on the budget committee because you want to know what he's talking about. And he has great ideas. So on cap and trade, he said this year we're going to raise through the auctions $1 billion. We're going to do $1 billion this year because we're really now upping the system. And our budget starts in July 1 of 2012 and goes to June 30th of 2013. So we're going to auction off these credits. I'm not quite sure how exactly it's going to be done, but you know, nobody kind of knows. But we're going to auction off these credits, and we're going to raise, he said, $1 billion, and that's going to help us to meet our AB 32 goals and our greenhouse goals. And our budget committee now can either approve it or not approve it. First of all, I really like being on this budget subcommittee. Senator Fuller, which is so interesting because these are the things you don't see. Senator Fuller is the Republican and Senator Samidian is the other Democrat, and I'm the Democrat on the committee. And the three of us get along so well. Republicans and Democrats, we vote this pretty much on the, and if we don't, we kind of give each other, you know, a lot of freedom on it. So it's not all what you see in the paper. There are, because you know, people have the same basically as they started off. They really, you know, they may think about the world differently, but they just want to serve their constituencies and do what they can. So the governor gives us this budget, this cap and trade, which he's doing $1 billion. We're not sure how he's going to do it. And he said half of the money we'll use to backfill, I think, the general fund for already existing programs that are already there. I think that's what he put in his budget. And the other $500 million are broad categories, $500 million that we would spend. So we said, what broad categories? What are you talking about? To be determined, he said. Not letting the secret out. So it will all, you will hear about this, I believe, Monday, if you listen, when he presents to the legislature, is May revised, because everybody is waiting to hear what is really going to be in this cap and trade that he's proposing. We're not really quite sure until we hear that. And that will be heard, I think, Monday. And so that will be one of the critical things. Plus the fact that our revenues are down again. It's not that we're making less money. It's our revenue, the state. Our revenues are down, but that's a whole other story. If any of you want to really read a very interesting article, read not this past Sundays, but the week before, the New York Times, front section, Sunday New York Times, I think a week and a half ago. It said that, you know, if you really want to talk about tax reform, you know, our taxes were based upon a non-digital economy. We're in a digital economy where things are moved around, monies are moved around tremendously. You know, there's a storefront in Nevada that is investing all of Apple's profits because Nevada has no corporate taxes. So Apple made more money last year than any company has ever made in the history of the country, or the world. I think even more than GM or Exxon, and made something like $47 billion in profit last year. And they paid no taxes. So there's that's a whole other issue. And that's not just in here, that's worldwide. What you read when you realize this is we are part of an international chess game that brings monies and resources that moved around, and governments are not the most powerful entities in this game anymore. That's it. That's the way it's done. Monies are moved around that are larger amounts of money than governments almost, you know, that we have. That's almost half our whole budget. We make a profit in the state of California. So we're going to be waiting. Now, how to spend this money, there are also two bills, which also, I think, are waiting to hear. There's the Speaker and Senator Pavley have also bills on cap and trade. They, too, are kind of what are known as spot bills at this time. You know what a spot bill is? You don't know exactly. You know you have a great concept, but you're not ready yet to fill in the specifics. I think they're both the Speaker and Speaker Perez in the Assembly, Pavley in the Senate, are waiting to fill in after they hear more completely from the governor and they're working on their own projects, what will be in the cap and trade. So, but you got to stay tuned to that, because California will be having, in an era of no money, It's an amazing thing, but it gets back to, I'm not quite sure that this is a sustainable funding stream. Last couple of weeks ago, the governor's committed half the cap and trade money to high-speed rail, so you never know what's real and what's not real about anything. But that's really where we are, that AB 32, we're beginning to implement it. One of the critical issues there, and I'll kind of move on. There are a number of other things I want to talk about, but what the critical issue on AB 32 will be, I think this year, will be the cap and trade allocation, and how we allocate those. The monies, whether the auctions really generate that amount of money, what really, what they're selling. It's unknown at this moment until we do that. Another critical one is last year, Governor Brown signed, I think it was SBX 1-2, which was our renewable portfolio. That was, I think, was Senator Simitian. Do you know about our renewable portfolio? Does anybody here know what we do? California also leads the nation, I believe, in that. The energy or the electricity that's produced in the state of California, the electricity that's produced, we had before the what we believe, which is now 10 years old, and which we didn't meet. We had said that by 2010, 20% of the electricity that was going to be produced in the state or purchased from outside, or all the electricity that we produce in the state, would be produced by renewable sources. That we changed up to now, and we didn't come quite that way. Some of the more municipal and non-investor-owned utilities actually reached that 20% level. SMUD reached it, and I think there were a number of them that did reach it. The investor-owned utilities did not reach that number, but now we've upped that number to 30%. I mean 33%, and so by 2020. 33% of the energy, the electricity will be produced by clean energy in California. That's quite different than anywhere else. And even now, we do not use in-state at all, and any coal, there's no coal that's used. But there is some, there are other forms, we do a lot of natural gas in the state. So as much as possible to move towards an economy that's based upon renewables, whether it's solar, photovoltaic, wind. But it was a very interesting listening, and I hear it all the time as a legislator. It's one thing to mandate this. It's another thing to actually implement it. And we've seen that when large projects want to develop in the state of California. One is that there are multiple agencies, both in the state, and we talked about, you've heard about that house that was about to fall over, and if it was anybody's house here, you'd want a decision made in an hour, but it may take years and years because there are so many different institutions. We here in California have that. And we're struggling with how do you both protect the public health, protect the environment, and also allow for, without having rigor mortis set in, allow for change to occur, allow for innovation, allow for development of some sort. And we struggle with that because we tended historically to develop things in silos. And you hear that. What I mean by silos, one agency kind of developed all their own regulatory processes, and they may be in conflict with another agency's regulatory processes, and they may be in conflict. And it's sometimes hard to reconcile all of these different differences. And we're such a large state, but it's no doubt, and it doesn't mean that we should get rid of regulation. It doesn't mean we should get rid of standards. You'll hear in this presidential debate one person say, get rid of it, too many. I don't think that. It's the issue on either side, and the other side will say, well, we don't, there aren't any problems. There are problems, but the problems are not that we shouldn't be setting standards. Of course we should be setting standards. but we have to figure out more ways to do it. I'll give you an example of that. Not quite the same as this, but once the next issue after the renewable portfolios, I want to talk a little bit about what I started talking before, was on goods movement, the ports. So I began to, as I'm in the legislature, do a number of bills to kind of get them to move in a particular direction. One was to not to let trucks idle in the port, two, to open the hours of the port so that we wouldn't have congestion on the streets all at the same time, better use of the resources, you get less pollution if you could stretch it out. Another one was to provide incentives for electrification, to move us off diesel as much as possible. Then I worked on the grants, and I wrote in 2006 a bond in which we put money in for clean truck replacements, and so we could replace the entire fleet of trucks. And so there were lots and lots of things that we did. But one of the things I learned, and we pushed, and I had a container fee that would have had money. I got it through the legislature twice, but each time the governor vetoed it, which would have provided resources. And it led to the ports themselves developing their own clean air action plans. And then the state's Air Resources Board also developing plans to figure out how are they going to reduce part of transportation reduction for greenhouse gases, but also to clean up the particulate matter, the immediate problem. They developed standards. We're going to replace all the trucks. We know trucks are going to be before 2000, have dirtier trucks older than 2008. And they began to develop a number of regulations and permitting. What ended up happening was, and I think this is some of the problems that happen if you kind of develop things just from the top down, is that all of a sudden the market out there says, wait a second, if you're going to tell me I have to do it a particular way, or I have to reduce it, why don't you give me some flexibility in how I get there and do it? As long as I meet your standard, why don't you do it? We're not good at that. Sometimes agencies are just good at, we set the standard at this level, ARB, because we have to set, but we're not really, they don't really know the business that well. They don't know that, there are a number of ways in which you can do this. And so the permits get denied. People say, I'm leaving California, I'm going to Florida, I'm going to, and a lot of that can all be corrected and dealt with. And especially around when we're going to be talking about adaptation. It's how you get a system in place, or systems in place, because it's so critically important that we not, that we begin to think that this is really happening now, just like the diesel particulates, it's going on now. We have to figure out ways of getting it. And so I think that's going to be critical to kind of legislatures to do that. I will tell you, institutions have a hard time becoming more flexible, but we're trying, I think that's going to be, whether it's Republican or Democrat, I think there's going to be more and more attempts to push things back to the local level. Still have national standards, but to let people figure out, set the standards aside, but to give flexibility in figuring out how to do it. I think you're going to see more of that, if it works. But you can only do that if you hold people really accountable, and you really set those and say, you got to do it. You're on your own, but if you don't do it, there are consequences. And if you do it, there are consequences. We don't do that really well. We're much better at, just declaring you got to do this, and this is the way, within this box. And I think really what we're at a point now is we're willing, and I think government, it takes a while, is willing to break down those boxes. And I don't think we've come to that resolution between the both parties, but it will happen. But there's got to be greater transparency and accountability in these systems, and people have to be held accountable to doing it, because we're talking about the public health, and we're talking about critically large issues. Okay, that's kind of what we've done on And in the ports, we've done cold ironing, you know, we're doing electrification, and they hopefully, as I mentioned, clean trucks. But in terms of adaptation, which I know, and which we've done, as we've heard at the federal level, and I'll tell you one of the reasons why it's so difficult to do. I'll give you one of my own reasons, I don't know. But we, in the state, have not done as much in terms of adaptation, just like at the federal level, I believe, than what we've done in, just like in Washington, we've done more in mitigation. The thing that's kind of interesting to me about adaptation come in a couple of areas. One is water policy. Now, I don't really know a whole lot. I kind of got dragged into water policy in the state, freshwater policy, not ocean policy. And because, as you know, that this is a state that the water, and if you maybe people in Southern California don't feel it as much, but if you go up north, people will tell you the water comes from the north and is used in the south. You know, they believe that we don't really have an understanding of the ecology of it. You know, we don't understand some of the issues around the natural, the Bay Delta, and how the water comes from the Sierras and comes down through the Bay Delta. And that's a natural ecological system that's being overused and overtaxed, not financially, but just overused. And then the water goes down through the California aqueduct, and water goes into the Central Valley, and then it's purchased, and it comes down to Southern California, and we either purchase the water, that water, or we use groundwater. It sounds very simple. But if you've ever heard of the Hatfields and the McCoys, we can't do adaptation because we're at war all the time. Water policy always ends up in the courts. That's what I've learned. Because everybody has water rights, and everybody believes that and water rights are like gold. And we can't resolve simple issues. You know, who owns what? I'll give you an example. Do you know what we're sitting on right here in Southern California, right here in Long Beach? Well, it comes down to Long Beach, but it really goes from basically from over in the west, from the basin up through the central basin. You know what we're sitting on? Huh?
Phil.
But besides that, well, right here we are, but as you go inland a little bit, we're sitting on one of the largest natural basins, aquifers in the nation, just about. We're talking about adaptation when we know that not only do we have to conserve, we have to figure out better water management, we have to figure out how we're going to protect ourselves, how we're going to have the ability to sustain ourselves with climate change, changing radically, and all and changing the actual climate change, and how much is going to be in the snowpack, and how much water we're going to have. We're going to have much more, you know, differences year to year. We can have much more massive fluctuations, as you're all studying. Well, one way to deal with that is to look at this aquifer that we're sitting on this basin, and to see that this basin actually has the capacity to hold about 550,000, I think, acre feet of water. I think that's the terminology, 550,000 acre feet. We only use about 200 to 230,000. That's all that's adjudicated. And we've been at war between different interests for 40 years, trying to figure out who owns what, who's in control, who's not in control, going back to the courts. So not only do we have to deal with things, really figure out long-range policy, as far as water is concerned, we find it very, very difficult to kind of work these, I think, in terms of this. So there's legislation now to kind of work this out. We cannot afford not to be able to store water, groundwater, in this basin. So those are kinds of things, but those have nothing to do with some of the, you know, scientific problems of climate change. That has to do with the politics of what goes on, and power and control and money. And people feeling like it's their investment, they want to control it, and they're and it happens through the Central Valley between the farmers and the ag interests, and it happens up north between those that want just to protect the delta and those others that want to use the delta as a way of moving water as a conduit through the state. And we find it sometimes, these are, I can just say these are issues that have been going on for years and years and years, and we're not been great at resolving. This is not just this goes back 40, 50, 60, actually the water rights and things of setting up goes back 100 years now, or even further in terms of what we do. And so that's one of the problems that we're going to have in terms of, and the other thing I'll tell you what California has done, and we're only going to see the fruition of it, is SB 375. And that's going to have a tremendous impact on adaptation also, how we adapt. Does anybody here, have you ever heard of SB 375? Huh? Anybody here heard of what's SB 375?
Go for it.
Well, it mandates more or less regional transportation, regional planning to try to decrease transportation, try to have somewhat more transportation-friendly.
Not just that. Not just that. What it is that, remember I mentioned before, one of the reasons why we have problems in doing, implementing and our policies and actually doing adaptation is we think in terms of silos. And so the state has transportation money that comes, and people use that, and there are planning agencies that deal with transportation. And then we have housing as another agency, and they do planning on housing. And then we have local governments who do their individual planning. And just we do not combine these in a regional plan that says, all right, if you want to get housing money and you want to get transportation money primarily, you have to come up with a regional plan that reduces greenhouse gas, really, that reduces vehicle miles traveled, that promotes transit, that does infill development, that new development in the state has to follow this kind of local planning model that is going to reduce the amount of time spent in the car, increase the amount of use of transit, and put your housing near where your transit is, and try to involve also planning for schools and others in this whole process, so that we have a lot, and that instead of the unit of analysis being the individual city, it will be the region to do that and to share that. I think land use decisions are critical to what we're talking about. If we don't have really good land use planning, we're not going to be able to kind of really deal with some of the tremendous impacts of climate change. So I think that's what the state is doing so far. It's got in place, it's got its 375, it's got its, it's AB 32. It's now beginning to say whether we can implement this. And I think that's the critical question. We're in a budget crisis. We haven't allocated money for anything in years. And as soon as there's another penny around every agency, everybody wants to do it, whether it's kids or whether it's seniors or whether we have been in a period of really cutting back everything. And so it's very hard to get rational planning when you're, as I mentioned, in the survival mode. But that's kind of where we are. It's both good and bad. The good is, or the bad is, we're really not, we've been stuck. We're now just beginning to implement it recently. The good news is we're probably doing more than almost anybody else is doing. There's nobody else doing more than we're doing out here. But there's a lot more to do. And questions? Thank you.